Good evening, everybody, and welcome to 2045 Plan the Reveal. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're excited to share our draft plan with you after about a year of intensive technical work and a lot of community engagement. So my name is Cynthia Lambert. I'm the Public Information Manager at MetroPlan Orlando, and I will be your host today. MetroPlan Orlando is responsible for planning 25 years into the future for Orange, Osceola, and Seminole counties. And that is an area that's larger than the whole state of Delaware. So as you can imagine, that's a whole lot of transportation projects over the next 25 years. So in today's webinar, we don't have time to talk about every single project that's in the plan, but we'll be giving you some highlights and covering the various categories so that you have a better idea of how to navigate the plan. And most importantly, we'll be listening to your public comments. The webinar recording will be available on MetroPlan Orlando's YouTube channel, and we will be posting the slides to our website tomorrow. So you can expect to receive an email from us once those links are up, and we'll be sharing the URL, the direct URL to our website where those documents will be found tomorrow. You will also find in your chat button on the Zoom toolbar a link to our YouTube live stream. So please feel free to share that with family, friends, business networks, so they can learn about the 2045 plan as well. So there are some key things that you should know about this plan. So let's talk about some of the numbers. We can go to the next slide, please. This is a $25.7 billion plan. So that's billion with a B. One major federal requirement that we have for our work is that the plan must be cost feasible. So in other words, that means that we have to be able to pay for the projects in the plan with revenues that we know are going to be reasonably available and coming in. So this is not a wish list. These projects that we're going to talk about today are actually what the region can afford. And we also do have a lot of unfunded needs, and we'll be talking about those as well. So you might be surprised to learn that about half of the money coming in for transportation through the year 2045 actually comes from tolls, which you see here on the chart in green. The Central Florida Expressway and Florida's Turnpike Enterprise oversee our toll road system here in Central Florida, which is a really important part of how we get around the whole region. So money from tolls is reinvested into the toll road system and is not spent on other types of transportation projects. So while we want to note the importance of our toll roads, we will not be talking about toll roads today in this meeting. We'll be focusing on the blue half of this chart, which is the federal, state, and local funds, because this pays for the majority of our transportation system. So let's take a look at how today's webinar will flow, our program for the day. This is all brought to you by your friendly MetroPlan Orlando staff. First, you'll hear a presentation on various aspects of the 2045 plan. Then we'll have a discussion with the team about some of the important policy issues that are related to the plan. Then we'll take some of your questions, and after that, we'll hear your public comments. So we encourage you to participate today. There are several ways. You can use the Q&A button on your toolbar to ask questions throughout the program. So during the presentation, if you hear something that you have a question about, feel free to hit that button and type your question right in. We're going to hold questions until the Q&A session, but you don't have to remember your question and hold it in your mind. You can just go ahead and type it right in when it comes to you. We will also be asking some polling questions during the session that you can answer for us. And the third way that you can participate today is by actually making a live public comment later in the meeting. And this is where, if you just want to share your opinions for the record, this would be the time to do it. And we'll be sharing some ways. If you're a little shy and you don't want to talk in this type of forum, there are some written ways that you can get your comments too. So we will be sharing those later in the program on how to do that. So all the comments that we hear today and throughout the official comment period for our plan will become part of the official record and be shared with the MetroPlan Orlando Board before they take action on the plan at their meeting on December 9th. And after the webinar, you'll also be able to share additional thoughts with us through a post-event survey that will pop up on your screen. So it's time for our first audience poll. So we want to get to know a little bit about you. So if you will indulge us, you should be seeing a polling screen pop up soon, and it will have 2 questions for you. The first question is, what types of projects are you most interested in learning about today? And you can choose as many as you're interested in there. And then the second question is, have you attended any of our previous events? We want to know if you've been with us before and have given us input into our plan. So we'll give you a few moments to answer those questions. I see a lot of responses coming in, so thank you so much for participating with us today. All right, and we'll share these results so that everybody can see them very shortly. Thank you to those of you who have participated before. We see we have quite a few people who were involved in our process, so we're glad that you made it to the finish line with us. This is great. Give you just about maybe 10 or 15 more seconds to decide on your answers and to submit those. Okay, and we will get ready to end the poll now. So get those last minute ones in. Okay, so here are the results from the poll. It seems that most of you are interested in learning about transit projects, also roads of interest, as is smart signals and technology. So those are the major areas there. That's great. And about 42% of you have attended our events before. So thank you so much for being with us again today. That is wonderful. Okay, so it is time to introduce our first speaker. Gary Hutman has been Executive Director of MetroPlan Orlando for the past 2 years, and before that, he served as our Deputy Executive Director. He has more than 30 years of experience in Central Florida's transportation industry, and today he'll be talking to you about why we plan so far into the future. Remember, you can use that Q&A button throughout the program to type in your questions, and at this time, I will turn it over to Gary. Gary, the virtual stage is yours.
Thank you, Cynthia. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us for a discussion on the region's transportation needs over the next 25 years, as Cynthia mentioned, and how we intend to meet those needs through the development of this long-range transportation plan. One of the first questions that you all might have is, why do we plan so far into the future? Many of you probably know that MetroPlan Orlando is the metropolitan planning organization charged by the federal government to lead transportation planning in our region. And again, just to remind you, that is Seminole, Orange, and Osceola counties. Now, our board sets the priorities and determines how the federal and state transportation funds are to be spent in the region. And, you know, it takes years to plan and design and implement major transportation improvements. So this is quite a job. Public input is an important part of the planning process that we go through, and we look forward to hearing your comments and questions later in the program. Producing a 25-year plan means we collaborate with our local government and transportation partners to make sure that the plan reflects the region's vision. The plan that we're going to be sharing today is a result of all of this teamwork. It meets the federal requirements, it addresses the growth that we expect for the region, and it makes the most of the available funding that we have access to. Next slide, please. The 2045 plan was guided by 5 major goals that help define what we want to achieve and how we plan to get there. And these goals include health and environment, safety and security, reliability and performance, access and connectivity, and investment and economy. These goals and the associated performance indicators guide the direction and focus of every other part of the plan, from prioritizing projects to spending the available funds. Next slide, please. For the past year, we've been talking to people across the 3-county region about what they envision for transportation as part of the outreach efforts for our plan. And I know that many of you have been involved with us through this process. So I too want to thank you for your interest and that you've stuck with us through this process. Several things have emerged from our discussions. First, we found that Central Floridians felt that all of our goals were important. When they were asked to rank the goals, they generally had a difficult time doing that. So the close rankings showed us that the participants expect us to succeed in each of the 5 goal areas. But the experience of the pandemic did seem to affect which goal ultimately rose to the top. In our pre-pandemic surveys, people told us that they valued access and connectivity the most. But since the surveys that have been done since the pandemic has been upon us, that has changed, and the top answer is now investment and economy. Overall, our residents showed very strong support for finding ways to mitigate our congestion problems by increasing the use of bus and rail transit, and by using technology to solve many of our transportation problems. Next slide, please. And finally, the plan represents a shift in our approach rather, that diversifies the system and emphasizes moving people rather than just vehicles. So we are looking at ways to meet our needs through a variety of transportation options. It's what we call in transportation world a multimodal approach. Some of the projects you'll hear about this evening would not have even been funded with the traditional roads-focused approach of the past. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to introduce members of the 2045 plan team who will tell you more about what's in store. Alex Trauger is our project manager for the plan, and he will talk about the process and outline the basics on plan development and funding. Nick Lepp is our director of transportation planning, and he will talk about roads and complete streets projects, and those are some of the more people-focused projects that help make roads safer and help make them more accessible. Nick will also talk about transit. Laura Bauk is a planner who focuses on technology and how that is part of the plan. Everything from smart traffic devices to connected and autonomous vehicles. Eric Hill is our Director of Transportation Systems Management and Operations, and Eric will join in the panel discussion later in the evening. Mike Wilson is a planner and will talk about key pedestrian, bicycle, and trails projects. Those of you who know Mike and are familiar with his work know of his passion for this. Then the panel discussion will be moderated by Virginia Whittington, and Virginia is our Director of Regional Partnerships. After the panel discussion, we'll take your questions. So let's begin with Alex.
Great, thanks, Gary. So our first topic and question we're going to cover this evening is how much money is available for transportation investment between the years 2026 and 2045. So this is the 20-year period outside of what we already have committed for funding from now in the next 5 years. Next slide, please. So as we are looking at this pie chart, this is based on a forecast of existing sources. And with that being said, we're projecting over $12 billion in federal, state, and local transportation revenues. As Cynthia mentioned earlier, this figure excludes toll-related funding, which is about another $12 billion. What is notable here, though, is that where our region where we have funding flexibility, we have really taken strides as part of this plan in more recent years to really diversify regional transportation investment, which I'll really talk about in a minute. But as we look at this chart, you'll see 8 categories in their percentage of total funds. But really what I'd like to call attention to is that the state roads and local categories fund all types of projects, from complete streets and new roads to high-tech solutions. So as Gary said, they are multimodal, they are intermodal, and don't let those chart labels mislead you. But that takes us to our next question, which is, where does all this money come from, and how is it generated? I'll talk about that in the next slide, please. And one of the main ways transportation is funded is through federal, state, and local gas taxes, fuel taxes. And the gas tax is not like a sales tax where the tax is a percentage of the total cost. A gas tax is actually a flat amount per gallon. So whether you're paying $4 a gallon or $1 a gallon, you pay the same amount of gas tax per gallon. So because of this, there are some inherent challenges with this funding source. As cars become more fuel efficient and people use and put more wear and tear on our roads, while at the same time paying less because they can drive farther on 1 gallon of fuel. Also, the number of electric vehicles is growing, and this is a great thing. This means cleaner air for the region and more efficient car travel for consumers, but less money collected in fuel taxes. And in fact, electric vehicles do not pay any fuel taxes because they're not consuming fuel, of course. So the bottom line here is that the gas tax is a declining funding source for transportation, but it still remains the primary federal and state source. So as we look to developing the cost feasible plan, as I'll show you on the next slide, please, so now we've kind of talked about, how we are spending those federal and state dollars based on public feedback and findings from our needs assessment and scenario planning processes. The 2045 plan established a few new funding programs. Some of these include using up to $250,000 a year for automated connected electric and shared vehicle demonstration projects, which was a recommendation of our recently completed Connected and Autonomous Vehicle Readiness Study. To provide safer and more comfortable walking conditions, we're allocating up to $1 million a year to fill those critical sidewalk gaps. We've also made available $300 million for local road widening projects. And we're following through with our board's existing policy of using up to 30% of our district dedicated revenue funds for premium transit operations. So as we go to the next slide, I'll talk about some ground rules as we develop the plan. So as we prepare and look to plan for the future, our first priority is to finish what we've already started and to make sure that projects with funded phases in our 5-year plan, our transportation improvement program, are finished first. These are what we call committed projects. I covered the second topic on my previous slides, but what I'd like to emphasize again is that where permissible, where eligible, we truly are aligning our funding with what we are saying is most important as a region objectively. So this is really important as we kind of talk, money to mouth. And to show that complete transportation picture in the third bullet, and to really understand the full system impacts, we include and adopt some projects by reference. And these do include toll projects, toll funded projects, as well as locally funded projects, as our organization does not have direct jurisdiction over these fund types. And we can go to the next slide, please. So now that we've talked about, how much and how we intend to spend our future transportation funds, the next question is, what can we afford? And we can go to the next slide. And before we get into the specifics, we do believe it's important to acknowledge roles and responsibilities again. So for projects on I-4, the state highway system, and those federally and state funded local road projects, these project types are programmed cooperatively between MetroPlan Orlando and the Florida Department of Transportation. Because we are an urbanized area, we receive federal funds, which are governed directly by the MetroPlan Orlando Board. And we program these funds and we advance projects consistent with our board's policies and direction and emphasis areas. And the last categories, as I mentioned before, includes toll and locally funded projects. Again, these are critical elements of the transportation system, but today we're going to talk exclusively about the federal and state funded categories. And with that being said, I'm going to turn things over to Nick and my other colleagues to tell you more about those projects. Nick?
Thanks, Alex. All right, good evening. The first list we're going to start with is our interstate or strategic intermodal system. Now, this is actually a statewide system. It actually elevates itself up as important for economics and connecting through airports, the ports, and other areas getting in and out of the state. It's actually so important that 50% of the transportation funding that comes to Florida is actually dedicated to the state strategic intermodal system. And this in our area includes I-4, the alternate I-4 project, and also truck parking. Next slide, please. So within our plan, we are continuing to support the state, and this is one of those projects by reference that comes in that Alex mentioned as the strategic intermodal system. So I-4 is looking to continue to be built and finished as the ultimate I-4 project. But also as note, as I mentioned earlier, is we have the truck parking, recognizing that the truck parking is deficient on I-4 and in our area for getting in our goods. We have that as our number one priority moving forward, and that is advancing. Next slide, please. The other category are our national and state highway systems. These are major roadways like State Road 50, State Road 436, US 192, and US 1792 are major arterials within the region. And this is actually one of our most comprehensive multimodal lists as it combines complete streets, operational improvements, safety, technology, and roadway widenings. That's $2.59 billion worth of projects, and actually quite significant. We funded quite a few of those, 244, almost all of their projects were funded. Next slide, please. And these are some of the projects that we were able to make cost feasible within our plan. Our number one project right now on our priority list has been the John Young Parkway Pleasant Hill Road widening along with the flyover. That it will now be fully funded within this plan, along with corridors like the State Road 436 complete streets, 535, which would be a widening and operations down there in the attractions area, Silver Star Road, looking at a complete street for more safety, and also Robinson downtown, looking at a complete street for more safety and multimodal accessibility. Next slide, please. There are off-state roadway system is one of the new programs to this plan. This is using the 10% that the state allows of their mixture of federal and state funds to be used off the state roadway system. So this will allow some of our local governments, instead of using their local funds to widen roads, major roads within the area, we have this other program to help support that. So widening projects don't currently have, if it's not on the state roadway system, a program unless they were going to be funded locally through their impact fees or general funds. Next slide, please. And these are some of those major roadways that are looking for widening within our plan. Rio Grande widening to 4 lanes, Upsala Road up in Seminole County, Canoe Creek, which I'm sure many of you have experienced that congestion on there, Coia-Popka Road, and then also County Road 46A. So this is a new program to help those local governments advance these projects faster than they normally would take to get implemented. Next slide. Now we're going to get into some of the programs that Alex was mentioning within that funding pot that MetroPlan has that control over programming. These are those urbanized area funds that come into our area because we are a large metro area. So these funds are dedicated to a couple different programs, which I'll let my colleagues go into after me, but this is the Complete Streets Project program. And these are really focused on safety, access for all users, not just automobiles. So this does not include any roadway widenings. We were looking for the complete streets approach of bike lanes, sidewalks, access to better transit, and also mixing in some land uses. Next slide, please. So within this, those complete streets are East Church Street up in Longwood, the Corinne Drive project, which we started the planning of this 4 years ago, and now looking to fund completely through this plan. Central Ave down in Osceola County, Kissimmee area, North Street corridor, and then also the Buenaventura Boulevard in Osceola County. So these will all be looking for enhanced accessibility and safety improvements. Now I'm going to turn it over to Laura to help describe some of our other programs where we dedicate some of those urbanized area funds to.
All right, thank you, Nick. So I'm just going to take a couple of minutes and talk about some of the Transportation Systems Management and Operations, or TSMO projects, and the Intelligent Transportation Systems, or ITS projects that are funded in our plan. These projects are, as the slide notes, focused on technology improvements. So the projects are aimed at improving reliability, efficiency, and safety through proven operational and technology solutions. Annually, the MetroPlan Board allots about 21% of the funds that they control towards these TSMO and ITS projects. And the allocation of these funds is coordinated and managed by our local partners through their participation on the TSMO Advisory Committee, which is one of our standing committees here at MetroPlan Orlando. As you can see on the slide, 133 million was allotted to these TSMO and ITS projects, and we were able to fund 34 projects with that pot of funds. If we can go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about types of projects. So first, I'm going to jump sort of to the bottom of the slide, talk about a couple of our recurring funding programs that will be included in the TSMO listing of projects, which is Table 11 in the cost feasible plan. So we'll be continuing to fund our annual signal retiming program, which is a recurring program over the life of the plan. We've had the signal retiming program or been involved with it since 2007, I believe. And this program is aimed at making sure that the signals in the region are in tune and that traffic is kept operating efficiently and safely. Another recurring program I want to talk about is the Automated Connected Electric and Shared, or ACES, Vehicle Demonstration Program. And this is a new recurring program that we're going to be using to help fund pilot projects in the region so that we can prepare to support these emerging technologies. The technology projects that are funded in the plan are often aimed at solving operational issues. Increasingly over the years, we've turned to technology solutions where there are travel time reliability issues in constrained areas where we can increase capacity. But we also consider where a technology solution can improve mobility more effectively than a capacity improvement can. So in addition to those two funding programs I mentioned before, there are other standalone TSMO and ITS projects in the plan that have been funded to do things like expand the amount of actively monitored and managed roadways in the region, to upgrade our signal systems, and to add sensors and other similar improvements. And with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Mike, who's going to talk a little bit about our bike ped and trail program.
Thank you, Laura. Pedestrian and bicycle are, of course, essential means for getting around our region. And as you can see here, we've got a bit over $100 million worth of projects identified in the plan, 13 key projects that are, of which 11 are fully funded and 2 are partially funded. The way we look at these projects and identify the needs is looking at what are the key destinations that people need to get to, such as workplace and school and parks and commercial destinations, and also connecting walkers and cyclists to the transit system, that last mile portion of that system. We also look at the projects from the standpoint of how well a new project is going to connect to other existing pedestrian or bicycle facilities. So we've got a more coherent network. And then, of course, we care about safety. And so we're going to look at where crashes are happening and how our facilities can positively impact that problem. On the next slide, I'm going to talk about a few featured projects out of the 13 that we've identified. The key thing is identifying critical sidewalk gaps. We've identified numerous sidewalk gaps throughout the 3-county region, ones that are essential for getting pedestrians to those walkable destinations close to home, close to work. And down at the bottom, similarly, getting kids specifically to school. So many of those are also sidewalk projects as well as crosswalk projects that are within 2 miles that walking distance that kids will take to school. And then we've identified a few trail projects here, the East-West Trail Connector, which runs from downtown Orlando out to Lake Underhill and connects to other facilities out in that area. The Shingle Creek Trail, a major regional trail, which will connect the West Orange Trail and Pine Hills at the top part, and running all the way down into Osceola County and down to the lakefront in Kissimmee. The E. Williamson Road Path, a shared use path along that road, will connect to the Seminole-Wekiva Trail and connect that trail to the town of Longwood. So that's just a few examples of what we're doing with pedestrian and bike. Now I'm going to hand it back off to Nick Lepp to talk about transit.
Thanks, Mike. Before I get fully into the transit, I just wanted to kind of give a little preview here. So when we talk about transit, there's 2 different types of funding. You have transit operations, which the cost to run the buses daily on our system, and then transit capital, which are the buses, the facilities that are needed to support transit. all the projects that you heard before from my colleagues are all kind of capital projects. They're roadway widenings, they're complete streets, where the funding is implemented, and once the project is complete, it's largely in place, with the exception of some maintenance and some repaving over the years. So when we talk about transit and the projects and the funding, the big difference is that operations, paying for those bus drivers and keeping that system moving. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So the projects I'm going to discuss right now are those capital facilities. That's what we can fund using the funding sources that we currently have out there today. So we're able to continue to support the existing fixed route service for Lynx and also Sunrail, projected out into the year 2045. But that's to maintain existing operations. That doesn't include any new routes or new service or any premium service that we may have discussed in previous plans and in previous presentations. What we can do is support the new southern and northern operation bases, which will help Lynx be a little bit more efficient with their current operations, but then give that ability to expand, adding more buses and ability to have more service. Also included are the parking expansions for Sunrail, Meadowwoods, Tupperware, and Poinciana stations. These have all been over capacity prior to the pandemic, but we do anticipate ridership to come back, where we will need that additional parking capacity at those stations to support the service. And then also Sunrail Phase 3. This is the connection between the airport and Meadowwoods off of Sunrail. We're able to fund the construction, that capital portion, but as I mentioned before, we don't have a dedicated revenue source to support the operations of transit within our region, which is that limiting factor in adding more transit or providing those public transportation projects that we've been talking about in our vision, but just haven't quite been able to get off the ground yet. Next slide, please. So that being said, Cynthia mentioned before that we have a $25 billion plan, but there are still plenty of unmet needs out there. We're spending over $25 billion on transportation projects that can be planned and implemented through the year 2045, but that really only covers about 60% of our needs. We still have over 16 billion in unmet needs. And as you can see from some of those large numbers, yes, that includes the tolls, some of those new toll facilities that we just don't have the anticipated funding outside of the plan, but then also that $7 billion in transit. As I mentioned, we can fund some transit facilities and buses, but we don't have the dedicated revenue source for those bus drivers to keep that system going for that expanded system. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Cynthia, and she's going to ask you a few more poll questions.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks, everyone. So as you heard from our transportation experts, there's a lot to like about this plan. It really works on trying to move people and providing access throughout our region. But as you also heard, there are a significant number of unfunded needs. So our next poll question that we are going to ask you we want to know if money happened to fall out of the sky tomorrow for this transportation plan, how would you like to see it invested? So we have a lot of different categories here for you to choose from. Add bicycle facilities, fill sidewalk gaps, improve intersections, more transit. And when we say transit, we do mean both bus and rail, more trails, road widening, safety projects, and smart signals and technology. So those are your options to choose from. If you can go ahead and give us your answers, you can pick multiple answers on this particular poll question. So you're welcome to do that. So we'll give you a few seconds. I see that we've got a good number of responses coming in already. All right, we will give you about another 10 to 15 seconds to think about it and to get your answer in. We do have a couple of leaders on the board here. I'll show you the results in just a moment. Okay, so we will get ready to close the poll now. And let me share the results with you. So as you can see here, most of you want to see the investment. You want more transit, both bus and rail. And that far outpaces all the other responses here. So 62% of you want to see more transit. 41% of you want to see smart signals and technology. 38% want to see safety projects. So we're glad to see safety make it up on the list. Safety is one of our top priorities at MetroPlan Orlando. So thank you so much for sharing your opinions with us. We really appreciate that. Next up, we'll have a discussion with the 2045 plan team to talk about some of the challenges that you might be wondering about. Then they'll answer as many of your questions as they can. So keep those questions coming using that Q&A button. Don't forget, you can just hit Q&A on your toolbar and type your question into us. Our discussion will be moderated by Virginia Whittington, our Director of Regional Partnerships, and we'll be joined by another staff member you haven't yet met this evening, Eric Hill, our Director of Systems Management, Transportation Systems Management and Operations. It's quite a mouthful. That's why we call it TSMO for short. So with that, I will turn it over to Virginia to lead our discussion.
All right, thank you, Cynthia, and good evening, everyone. I'd like to invite the team to join me if you haven't already. And let's get right into our questions. We're going to start with health and the environment. Mike, how does the 2045 plan support transportation that can improve public health?
Well, as you saw, we've got a number of pedestrian and bicycle projects and complete street projects, all geared toward helping people get to destinations, their routine destinations, more on through active transportation, right? By moving their bodies rather than pushing the accelerator. That also works out for helping people recreate more, right? Many of the trails and other facilities are also useful recreation even if you don't have a specific destination in mind. Other things that we look at when we're prioritizing projects overall is what's the impact on things like air quality, right? If we can have fewer people driving single occupant vehicles through transit, biking, walking, et cetera, that's going to improve our air quality, and it's especially important for those with respiratory issues. And while it's not exactly health, I mean, safety is part of it as well, right? If you're injured in a traffic crash, that's going to have long-term consequences on your health. And while we do look at that separately, they're definitely related.
Virginia, I'd like to just add to that too. You know, public health is something that we started to consider probably about 6 years ago. We decided that it was worth taking a look at public health and how transportation investments could kind of move the needle and support public health, because tremendous amounts of money are spent in the public health area. And so, you know, I'd just like to draw attention to the transit projects and the investment in transit that we're calling out, and not just what we can afford, but also what we can afford. Because as Mike mentioned, you know, anything that we can do to get people to be a little more active is a good thing. And by improving transit to make it more attractive to the user, that gets people perhaps walking 5-10 minutes in the morning that they wouldn't otherwise do, 5-10 minutes in the afternoon that they wouldn't otherwise do. So I think that the transit piece is also important.
Great. Well, thank you. And we all know that anytime you get out and get moving, that active participation in getting from point A to point B is always going to go a long way towards helping in our own our own health. So next question, what does the 2045 plan do to protect Central Florida's natural environment or avoid negative environmental impacts? Gary or Mike?
Well, I'll jump in there. I think that this plan is the first time that we've considered the environmental impacts, and we've actually costed them out. And I'd invite Nick and Alex to jump in there. I believe that's true, that there is a cost component to the environmental section of the projects.
That is correct, Gary. So previously, plans have just identified the need to go through the traditional phases of PD&E, then you design it, then you acquire right-of-way and then construct. But within that right-of-way, you need to identify things like ponds for stormwater. But also it could take some mitigation. You could be disrupting some very important wetlands or natural areas. And if you can't mitigate through the actual project itself in that area, we want to make sure that they are doing the equivalent for, say, they call them mitigation banks. where they will purchase pristine natural lands out in another area to replace the ones that they may be disrupting during a roadway project. But what we did find in this plan, more so than previous plans, is we have less roadway widening projects than before. We are really looking at optimizing the system, looking at technology, complete streets, and other mobility mechanisms to try to avoid these larger wide roads that could take some of those lands in environmental issues.
Great, thank you, Nick. And we know that health and the environment is so important to so many people. And we always want to be cognizant of those things that people are most interested in and the things that they want to protect as we are developing these plans. Eric, let's move to the topic of transportation equity. How does the 2045 plan ensure equity in transportation, or how do we make sure that the system serves everyone?
Good question, Virginia, and thank you. Equity in transportation seeks fairness in mobility and accessibility to meet the needs of all community members. This has not always been the case, especially for communities of color and low income. However, equity in transportation has evolved and include aging, limited English proficiency, disabled, and veterans communities, often referred to as vulnerable populations. Equity is a goal in our long-range plan. It's goal number 4 under health and environment. But beyond this, MetroPlan Orlando is required by federal laws and directives to ensure equity. And this includes Title VI of Civil Rights Act of 1964, Environmental Justice Executive Order of 1994, Limited English Proficiency Executive Order of 2000. We're also required to do an analysis of low-income and ethnic and cultural communities to just understand where those areas lie in our planning region and how our investments are impacting those areas. And then we're also required to look at the outcomes to avoid and minimize and mitigate disproportionately high and adverse effects of transportation projects on these communities, and ensure full and fair participation in decision-making, and prevent denial of, reduction in, or delay in receipt of benefits from the investments that we make. Our project selection process supports projects that benefit vulnerable populations. So on the front end, we wanted to advance projects that seek equity in transportation. And on the back end, our plan includes several measurements to evaluate how well we're doing to ensure equity in our transportation program.
Great, thank you, Eric. And I understand that there are certain weights that are applied to different criteria that help us to determine how these projects are equitably distributed. Alex?
Yeah, I'll speak to that briefly. So as part of the 2045 planning process, we developed a multi-criteria analysis that we use to prioritize all of our projects. And there's some different subsets of the criteria, but I think what's important to note here is that all of our project lists that we've talked about use 5 criteria that address social and financial equity issues, as well as health indicators. So about 20 to 25% of our criteria, the indicators that we're prioritizing on, address that category. The remaining, 80 to 75% of the criteria address the remaining issues as it pertains to safety, economy, reliability, as well as performance.
Great. Well, thank you, Alex. Nick, I heard a phrase years ago called the silver tsunami, and that we needed to be on the lookout for the aging population in Florida. How does the plan support the aging population and access to essential services?
So part of the needs as we were developing them, we wanted to look at making sure that you didn't just have access by having a single automobile. If you did not have automobile access, how can you get to not only just your job, but essential services, healthcare services, banking services. So we wanted to make sure that we were identifying these gaps in our areas, not just for the aging population, but for any disadvantaged population that may not have access to an automobile and have transportation challenges. So a lot of our needs were based on, well, how can we get to everybody to their jobs in the most efficient way possible, but then also lowering some of that transportation cost to them, which could just be time, the time it takes to get there. But then also we have some recommendations as we looked at possible food deserts, areas where you don't have access to a lot of food choices, but then healthcare areas where you may have to travel long distances to see your doctor. We wanted to identify those gaps within the plan, where we can work with our local government partners, not just on a transportation solution, which could be a new bus route or access to a sidewalk, but it could be a land use issue where we could work with our local government and say, hey, these areas are kind of missing some grocery stores. If you had one in there, we could reduce some of those trips and provide better access to this community.
Right. And as we continue to talk about the transit story, you've heard it tonight in the last poll, and members of our community tell us constantly that they want more transit. But there are a significant number of unfunded needs in that area. What would have to happen to expand the system and give the region a robust transit system that provides access to jobs and services? And what changes in the funding picture are needed to help the region significantly improve our transit options?
Well, Alex kind of hinted to it at first. Our first revenue source, or our primary revenue source for this whole plan, are gas taxes, and those are dwindling. So even under our current state, we wouldn't have the ability to do as many of the facilities or capital projects that we're talking about for transit. But more importantly, how I kind of talked about it in the beginning, it's that operations cost. There isn't a dedicated revenue source that can support the operations of transit beyond what's currently out there for Lynx and Sunrail. So to have that expanded transit and implement some of those premium corridors, BRT corridors that we've talked about on State Road 50, US 192, and State Road 436, there would have to be a dedicated source of funding within this area, very similar to what Orange County tried to implement through the sales tax, which would have been a dedicated source for the operations and expansion of transit. And we would need something along those lines to fulfill that transit vision that we all have.
Orange County was poised to put that on the ballot, but understanding that this is a very trying time, the Board of County Commissioners made a very, very tough decision to pull back on that, understanding the sensitivities of where people are. I'm sorry, go ahead, Nick.
Oh, and I was just going to say, and we, in recognizing that, we have made our plan very nimble and have that ability to adjust if Orange County decides to go forward, or if any other county decides to go forward with that, so we can be ready to implement this transit vision that we have within the plan.
Great, and that's an excellent segue into the next question. Occasions such as not being able to advance a transportation surtax or declining sources of revenue, like you mentioned earlier, Alex, you said that the gas tax is a declining source, but it's the primary federal and state source. And most of our transportation funding has traditionally come from the gas tax. The pandemic, especially early on, drastically cut the amount of driving and the amount of tax that is collected. I know that my driving drastically declined over these past few months, and also electric vehicles that are becoming more popular, and knowing that those vehicles don't use gasoline. How can the 2045 plan adjust for changes and uncertainties as state and federal funding sources may fluctuate in the future?
That's a great question. I'll kind of answer it kind of two-pronged. The first is, with scenario planning, and that's something that was another first for this plan. We went through an exploratory process and looked at 4 alternative futures to really start to try to better understand and plan for those disruptions, those types of technological innovations, and what that will mean to other other drivers and impacts of change. And we also looked at kind of the impacts of rapid growth, but also lower growth. So we did that, like I said, through a scenario planning process, and we've talked a lot about that over the past year, and actually had a Future Fest webinar that delved pretty deep into that. Kind of the other prong and kind of second element of this is that MetroPlan Orlando, by creation, manages a continuing and a cooperative and a comprehensive planning process. We call it the 3C planning process, and really focusing on that term continuing. All of our planning products, our prioritized lists, our 5-year work plan, and our long-range plan are all living documents. So we update them frequently, regularly, every 5 years by law, but also by best practice, to really reflect and revisit assumptions and recalibrate some of the tools that we're using based on new information and research. We also have protocols that we can follow to modify or amend our plan at any time if that is the prerogative of one of our funding partners. So we are able to stay agile and nimble and respond to these uncertainties. We do our best to probabilistically plan for them, but we acknowledge it is extremely challenging planning for the unknown. So we'll be back, 3 to 5 years from now, having a similar discussion and kind of re-examining the investments and the strategies that we're pursuing today.
And I'm glad you mentioned the words, "we will be back," because that also ensures the public that as changes are made or need to be made along the way, that we do bring those changes back to the public to weigh in on. And so now the answer, the $24 million question, has to do with technology. Laura, how does the 2045 plan help the region prepare for technological advances that are certain to occur? The changes have probably been made since we started this conversation tonight, but certainly those that will occur before 2045. How do we address those?
Thanks, Virginia. So yes, how do we address the changes that are ongoing, really? So I talked about on the slides that I presented earlier, some of those pots of funding that we have. We have this $250,000 per year in our automated connected electric and shared vehicle program that could be put towards looking at pilot projects every year. That's going to help things. There's another pot of funding that I didn't talk about, our regional TISMO program. That's $1 million per year. And that is something that, again, our TISMO committee helps to prioritize, but those funds can go towards things like upgrading our signal cabinets so that they can work with the sensors that are being placed to talk to those connected vehicles, putting more sensors out on the roadway, other types of CAV technology. Within the plan, we reference projects that CFX is working on. They have some funding going towards connected vehicle demonstration projects. And then on the planning side, there are funds in there for things that we can do as MetroPlan, as planners, to start helping to prepare the region. Right now, we're talking with some of our partners on an electric vehicle charging station roadmap, because electric vehicles are here and they're going to continue to come. And then also looking at things like outreach and education, so we can teach our partners and the general public just about what is an automated vehicle, what's a connected vehicle, what's the difference. All of those things, I think, go towards helping prepare the region for those things that are here and that are going to be here even more in the future. Anything to add, Eric?
Thank you, Laura. And another good question, Virginia. MetroPlan Orlando has greatly benefited from a history of information communication technology investments in the region. This goes back over 20 years, starting with our surveillance and message devices on I-4. From these investments, we've learned a great deal about the usefulness of technology, and have partnered with our local with the local jurisdictions to deploy these technologies on their roads. Alex also, again, mentioned that the MTP will invest $133 million in 34 projects. And some of the items mentioned by Laura, such as the traffic signal technology and sensor detection technology, has been a boon to improving response times to incidents, traffic incident management, road rangers, operations on the interstate. And I'm sure many of you have already benefited from this investment, as I have. But perhaps the biggest payoff to date from these investments is data that we've been able to harvest from the network to assist in management and operation of the roads, transit, pedestrian, bicycle facilities, and why we're here tonight, planning. A lot of the data that's been collected has been used in updating our long-range plan. Also, data is at the heart of active transportation, such as ride and bike sharing, trip planning, where travelers can combine and coordinate their trips between several modes, which is part of the future of mobility. And Mike spoke a little bit about this earlier. And then lastly, technology will continue to assist us in improving the performance and reliability of our system and make our network much safer.
Oh, great. Thank you, Eric. Now that's all the time that we have questions for the panel or the discussion portion of this the panel. Now let's take some questions from our audience. Now we do see that there are some questions that have already been submitted, and if you have a question, please use that Q&A button on your toolbar. We'll get to as many questions as we can in the next few minutes, and I'm going to start with those that we have. Our first question is from Mr. McKee. Is there any possibility that the trails 1% should or would be increased? Is there an opportunity for increasing trail funding?
I'll actually jump in there. So, I mean, we have our funding program right now for TMA, for our urbanized area funds that the board set at those percentages. However, we use those percentages going into developing this plan. That's when Alex was kind of talking about nimble and changes in times. That could be something that would be discussed every year as we're developing that project priority list and those projects that's for what's next that we're going to look for funding. We can discuss and look to see if there are shifts in those funding sources or programs where some could shift from complete streets a little bit more to trails. That's something that we will bring up annually.
And if I could briefly add to that, and just something to acknowledge, the percentage is all about the denominator. And if we kind of look at the bike ped or trails kind of active mobility portion of the funding within the funds that MetroPlan Orlando controls, because we're an urbanized area, we're actually spending up to about 17% of our federal urbanized area funds for bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. So sometimes, like I said, some of those numbers kind of get washed out by some of the other figures, but where we have the control, where we have the latitude, we're moving in that direction of complete streets, safety, and technology.
And one more thing I would add is that we have a number of projects, such as complete streets projects, that are including a shared use path as part of it. And so that's not reflected in that 1% that you see as well.
All right, thank you. Our next question is, what is the consensus about reducing speeds on urban arterials and collector roads to be safer from 45 miles an hour to 35 miles per hour? Higher speeds make pedestrians and bicycle travel much more dangerous. They're looking for traffic calming strategies near schools.
Absolutely. The speed of traffic is an essential component of our pedestrian and bicycle safety problem. And we're looking at a number of corridors right now where we've had especially intensive pedestrian and bike crash issues, and looking at the overall context of those corridors. And we can't just slap a sign up and change the posted speed from 45 to 35. We have to be able to justify the posted speed based on the context of the road, the design of the road. And once we do a thorough analysis of that, then we can find opportunities where the speeds can be brought down through a combination of redesign and reallocation of space. And in some opportunities, perhaps just for a straight ahead, speed reduction if that's warranted. But generally, it does require some sort of modification to the road first.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mike. Our next question, what is the status of the BRT proposed a few years ago for the west side of Orlando?
Still part of our transit vision and a priority for the region. But as I mentioned earlier, transit is a little different animal than roadways and trails. It's that operational funding, that dedicated revenue source to support keeping that bus going up and down State Road 50 on the west side for a year or more. We don't have that, and that's why the project hasn't advanced beyond its planning stage that it's in right now.
Great, thank you, Nick. Our next questioner wants to know what specific plans are being considered to make transportation more accessible, particularly for the blind and visually impaired. For example, more APSs. I'm guessing this is automated pay systems, autonomous vehicles, etc.
Well, I can start on that one. Sorry, Eric, I jumped on you.
Go ahead.
One thing that Lynx is actually currently working on is what's called a concept of operations study for an automated shuttle. They're looking at perhaps doing one on the Orange Line here in downtown. And as part of that study, they formed a user group, and participants within that user group were blind and visually impaired. So that's one thing that's at least being considered. And you can stay tuned for some project results from that one. Open up.
Yeah, and there's a lot of talk about automated vehicles being used to help or assist those that are disabled that now rely on transit vehicles or access or paratransit service such as Access Links. But we are ways away from when that will be implemented. There's still a lot of testing going on. And it's not, I think, as simple as to think that, the vehicle is going to pull up and someone's going to be able to just come right out and get into the vehicle. Because there is that portion of the trip that has to occur from where the person is to the vehicle. And so that's just one of the small challenges that we have as we start to perfect this technology and put it into play so that it is useful and that it does work.
And if I could, regarding the issues of accessibility, particularly on a pedestrian level, anytime we touch a sidewalk, a road, an intersection, it has to be brought up to the current standards for Americans with Disabilities Act. And APS, by the way, that's audible pedestrian signal.
Okay, thank you, Mike.
And that's something that we generally don't get down to that level of detail, but that's something that any traffic engineer who is looking at the conditions of an intersection should be taking into consideration, understanding what are the local populations that might have need for an audible pedestrian signal.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm going to try the next question two questions come from the same person. So I'm going to try to put these two together. Would filling sidewalk gaps have more economic stimulus than widening the roads, especially since everyone's a pedestrian? And then how much is being focused on that last mile for transit, both bus and rail?
Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
All right, I'll jump in first. I think all transportation investments have a positive benefit on the economy, whether it's sidewalk, roadway. You're really investing in people getting to their destinations. Would I say that it's more than a roadway? I think it would depend on the location and what the need is. I don't think we can generally categorize all roads versus all sidewalks and all transit investments together in that way. And then to jump on to the last mile, yes, as MetroPlan, we're developing our needs, and I was talking about accessibility to essential services and destinations, food deserts. That's also transit. So we've identified the areas where it takes multiple modes just to get to transit, or if there are gaps in sidewalks or bike lanes and you don't have any access to transit, that's a significant portion of our population. So we're looking to fill that gap in and make it more accessible to public transportation.
Great, thank you.
And may I add, just in terms of that last mile, when we talk about active transportation, that's part of it. How can we get people to be more active? So that last mile doesn't have to be a car ride, it can be a bike ride, or it can be a nice walk. And then in addition, you do have the network companies, transportation network companies that do fill in that gap of the last mile.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Eric. So this next question is, how closely does MetroPlan Orlando work with city and county zoning departments to accomplish what I believe Nick mentioned about bringing services closer to home to encourage walking instead of driving?
Yeah, this is actually new to the plan. We do work with our local government partners, which does include land use. However, MetroPlan doesn't have any specific authority over land use, but we wanted to use this to work with them as partners to identify some of those gaps that could be solved with a land use decision versus a transportation investment to get people closer to one of their essential services. So this is something we will be doing as we implement this plan over the next couple of years, working with our local government partners.
Thank you. So this has to do with gas tax. Can Orange County put a 1% sales tax on all fuel sales, including electric recharge stations? Is that something that Orange County or Osceola or Seminole could do? Including electric recharge stations in there.
I don't know if anybody else can jump in, but I don't think I have a direct answer on that. There would have to be some research on the funding availability question with taxes.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I would say off the cuff. Yeah, I don't believe there is a statutorily available source, that would provide, a sales tax just on certain items. Normally, it's the opposite, kind of excluded items. That's normally how the other excess charter county infrastructure sales tax works. Those two sources that I just mentioned, those two sales tax mechanisms available to our local governments, do provide the opportunity to develop both on the capital side, but also the operations and maintenance side. So, as we talk about funding our transportation future, funding our desired vision, I think we have to look closely at those funding sources, those mechanisms, to see what they are possible of doing. Not all of them are created equally. There's kind of caveats to each of them, how they can and shall be spent. So I think, as our local partners, explore those options and pursue those options, that is what they have in mind, the use and discretion over those funds.
All right. Well, thank you for that answer, Alex. And this is our last question that we have submitted so far. But if you are listening in and you have a question and you'd like to submit it, please do so. Use that Q&A button. And again, we'll get to as many as we can. Is there an effort to make part of the tourist tax a perpetual operating source or pool for mass transit? The need is definitely tied to the workers in this industry. Is it?
I mean, that would be a local government decision. Unfortunately, MetroPlan doesn't have any control over those taxes. It would be, we would love to have another revenue source for that, including the plan, but that would be a local government.
Yeah, I agree, Virginia. And there's always discussion, or frequently there's discussion about tourism taxes and what it should go to pay for. And transportation is always there, kind of at the table, but agree with Nick, it is a local decision.
Okay. And always a part of the conversation that is happening in our local governments. So how are projects brought to MetroPlan for funding or implementation? Is that by each county, or is there an approval process? Can you all talk about the process?
Yeah, so there are a couple different channels, really. One, through this long-range planning exercise, and I've talked a lot of needs assessment at past, virtual meetings. But we went through a process of looking at existing plans and studies to identify needs, but also we sought out other needs and challenges and identified, projects and opportunities to address those issues. So there's multiple means our local governments can sponsor and identify their projects through this planning process, and post, as I mentioned, the living process that this is. The approval process is our board's adoption of this 2045 plan, but as it relates specifically to implementation and programming, that happens annually as part of our transportation improvement program, where our board does adopt our transportation improvement program annually and takes amendments to that plan monthly.
Great. Well, thank you, Alex. And then the last question actually has to do with MetroPlan Orlando's partnership with other metropolitan planning organizations that are within the region. We are one of 6 that come together on a quarterly basis. And that is, their next meeting is in January of next year. So they last met in October, and they will be meeting again together in January. And I'll invite you to go to MetroPlanOrlando.org and check the calendar section for that accurate date of that meeting. But we do come together quarterly. Well, we want to say thank you to all of the panelists tonight. And those of you who have submitted such good questions. This is all the time that we have for this segment. And now I will turn it back over to Cynthia to continue with our program.
Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who submitted a question. We had a really great discussion, so we very much appreciate it. Well, now it's our turn to listen. So we're at the time for public comments, when you can register an opinion that will be relayed to the MetroPlan Orlando Board and become part of the official record. So the board will be taking action on the 2045 plan on December 9th. This meeting is a public meeting and also includes an item on that agenda for public comment. So you're welcome to join us for that as well. The public can participate virtually in that meeting. But to make a public comment tonight, please use the raise hand button on your toolbar. If we can go to the next slide, please, so that we can take a look at the different ways that you can make public comment. So again, if you're looking to make an oral comment tonight, you can go ahead and hit that raise hand button on your toolbar. It's located at the bottom of your screen. And if you're joining us with phone only access tonight without video, you can press *9 to raise your virtual hand. Again, that is *9 if you are a phone only caller today. When your name is called, your microphone will be unmuted. You may have to accept that unmute prompt, and you'll be able to make your comment. So please state your name and contact information for the record. Each speaker will have 3 minutes to state their opinions. And if you're not ready to make your comment today, or you're a little shy about making it in this type of forum, so you can see on the right hand of the screen, there are several other ways that you can submit your comment to us in written form. So you can either email us at mtp@metroplanorlando.org. You can fill out an online comment form at the URL that's on the screen, metroplanorlando.org/2045 draft plan. Or we also have a phone comment line set up where you can call and leave a voicemail. And that number is on your screen. It's 407-906-2347. And you have until November 20th to make your comment. So our comment period will be open until November 20th. So it's about another 10 days or so. So again, we invite you to raise your hands if you'd like to make a comment today. I see that we have we had at least one person that had their hands raised. Maybe they changed their mind. Oh, here we go. Okay, so I will go ahead and start unmuting folks. And our first speaker is John Puhek. Hello, John. Can you unmute? Are you able to?
Yep.
Okay, wonderful. We can hear you. Thank you.
I'm encouraged about the change of emphasis of the community from moving vehicles to moving people. However, constrained by the funds we have, it appears that over the next 20 years, about the best we can do on Lynx and Sun Rail is to adjust structure hours and changing routes. I don't see much of any serious increase in lines and probable unless we get more funding. The same with the bicycle trails and facilities. Most of the items are unfunded, and I would really like to see a plan added after this that says what we're going to do with that 1 cent sales tax.
Thank you, John. Appreciate that. Okay, do we have anybody else who would like to comment today? Okay, next up we have Wedna Dalterus, and I'm so sorry if I butchered your name. I'm going to go ahead and send you an unmute prompt. You can start your comment at any time. Can you hear us? Okay, we can't hear you at the moment. I do see that you were unmuted.
Hello.
Oh, yes. Okay, we can hear you now. Hello. Thank you.
Hello. Good evening, everyone. I'm representing Future Leaders United under the United Foundation of Central Florida. And on behalf of everybody in this foundation, we're very encouraged and happy to see what the future holds. You know, guys, thank you guys so much for hosting this. It was very interesting. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. We appreciate that. And we hope that you are able to make it to some of our other events. We do, I didn't mention this earlier, but all of our meetings are open to the public, and we have a very thorough calendar on our website, MetroPlanOrlando.org. So if transportation is something that you're interested in and you want to keep up with, that is a great source of information. We have a ton of info on our website. Do we have any other members who would like to speak today? I'll give you just a moment to think about it and decide. I see Sherry Bruin. Hang on, Sherry, I will unmute. Oops. Okay, Sherry, can you unmute?
Hi.
Hey there.
This is Sherry, and I have two comments. One, first, I want to thank MetroPlan for the tremendous job they did with our Blind Americans Equality Day celebration. It was wonderful, and a lot of it was because of you guys. So I want to publicly thank you. And then the second, well, two more things. I also think there are a lot of mandates here that are unfunded. And I think for us to catch up with other cities that have more modern transportation networks, we somehow need to get dedicated funding sources. So I'm all for that. And then the third thing is I'm really happy to have things like the Lynx Paw Pass to pay for rides, paratransit, and I know you can buy bus passes with that too. Is there any way we could go from that to, say, a card that could be scanned for whatever source of transportation we might be using, be it bus or the Sunrail or paratransit? And those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sherry. We appreciate it. And we really enjoyed participating in the Blind Americans Equality Day. So thanks for that invitation. Do we have any other folks who would like to make a comment today? Go ahead and hit that raise hand button. Okay, I'm not seeing anybody else right now. So I will remind you that you can send in comments in written form or leave us a voicemail on our public comment line. So let's see, we'll give you another 10 or 15 seconds to decide on whether you want to give a public comment. Now, it might be a little bit intimidating in this kind of forum when lots of folks are listening online and you can't see their faces. Okay, so I don't see any more coming in. So we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. We just want to thank you so much for caring enough about transportation in your community to participate with us today and for joining us. We hope you learned a lot. Right after this webinar ends, you'll see a short survey that pops up on your screen and asks for your thoughts on the program today. So please take a couple of minutes and let us know what you thought and how we can improve future programs. There will also be a space on that survey for you to send us in your comments as well, and we'll add those to the record. This webinar video and the slides will be available at this URL that's on the screen tomorrow. So you can review and share it. We'll also be sending everyone who registered an email with direct links to those items. And again, the URL is metroplanorlando.org/2045 draft plan. Don't forget, you have until November 20th to comment on the plan. But again, thank you so much for joining us for the reveal of Central Florida's 2045 plan. Have a wonderful evening.